Up you go, hackers. Welcome to the SDSF podcast, Premium Edition. This is Season 32, Episode 3, and I'm your host, C.S. Joseph. February has been a very fantastic month, a difficult month, but a very fantastic month in terms of breakthroughs that we've been having with this psychology. And we're getting to the point where we're releasing a lot of Octagram-related content, and I'm just so happy that for how far we've come as a community, and how far we've come as a team with our research and being able to change people's lives for the better from an octogram perspective, so that everyone understands that fundamentally no one has a better understanding of Jungian analytical psychology other than us. What is the octogram of the ENFJ archetype? So ENFJ archetype, looking at the octogram for the ENFJs and the different octogram related variants of the ENFJs. And of course, ENFJ is absolutely, hands down, my absolute favorite of the 16 types. That's not true. That's not true, actually. But my favorite type is, I think, my type, actually. Lower that and ISTPs, but still. Maybe that's why I'm so hard on them. ENFJs, also known as the mentor, also known as the cleric, according to our type grid that we have. And, they're great people, right? Full of that pride, deadly sin, right? Got that living virtue of humility, and then from a virtue and vice standpoint, you have benevolence versus cruelty, right? Great people. Everyone has their hang-ups. Everyone has their advantages. Everyone has their disadvantages. There's not much we can do about it. That's just how people are, right? But the reality of the situation is that while ENFJs are like my, favorite type of the 16 types, how they express, in terms of octogram is entirely different. And that's necessary to understand, because it's not enough anymore to just know the type grid and know a person's type out of the 16 and know their functions and know the four sides of the mind. It's not enough anymore. We've come to realize that through our octogram related research and also testing out in the field through field testing, we've come to realize that nurture is insanely important, if not just as important as nature. And while the nurture has it changes over time in a person's life, if you can pinpoint nurture, it really adds, from an ego hacking perspective, a new level of attack surface, but also from just a basic relationship point of view and how to interface with people, how to parent them, how to be in a sexual relationship, how to be friends with these people, from a camaraderie as well as a compatibility perspective. Well, guess what? It's so much easier to interface with somebody based on their nurture than it is with their nature. And I think the reason why is because ultimately people in general expect to be interfaced with their nurture. They expect it. It's something that they're used to. So, it's not something they're going to get caught off guard by, which is entirely necessary. It's kind of like, when you're trying to finesse a woman into sleeping with you, for example, and you're in that particular situation and you're finessing her. Well, the thing is that if you're too good to be true, you're too good to be true. But when you're interfacing with someone's nurture, you don't exactly come off like you're that person who is too good to be true. Same goes if you're trying to land a big sales deal, right? Same goes if you're trying to convince somebody of something. Same goes if you're trying to have an argument with somebody. It doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? So in any case, ENFJs, they're subject to, their own nurtural whims and the nurtural whims of other people, just like everybody else, right? They're not impossible to deal with. Thing is that oftentimes ENFJs put themselves in the position of being indispensable to their family, indispensable to their church, indispensable to their community, indispensable to their job, indispensable. It's just they become the most indispensable person. And when they become the indispensable, then they become the most cruel. And that's kind of an issue, that ends up becoming a huge problem. I actually released a lot of ENFJ related content based on acolyte questions that have been coming in recently. And a little bit of that content will be discussed actually in the context of this lecture today. I have the pleasure of remembering 4 different ENFJs who are the different octogram variants, which is SDSF, SDUF, UDSF, and UDUF. And, octogram is just like this huge, amazing, fun little playground for us as ego hackers to play in and figure out, as we're going out in the field and testing it out and just kind of understanding where people are and where they're coming from. So, as per tradition of this season, what exactly is the octogram, just to get it out of the way? It's basically the ego hacker version of Enneagram, except Enneagram has a nature component, and then because it's nature plus nurture in one system, it becomes a problem. Octagram is literally nurture only, and we cut out the nature piece because when you combine it with the 16 types personality theory according to Jungian analytical psychology, which is just nature only, nature plus nurture ends up creating confusing because the 2 nature components of the Enneagram and the MBTI, for example, end up being a problem with one another. So it creates an unreliable system. And then because it's unreliable and it lacks consistency all the time, because it lacks consistency, right? This lack of consistency leads to the MBTI or 16 personality theory, Jungian analytical psychology, or 4 sides dynamics. It ends up getting a bad rap when it's considered by other people. Even objective personality system on Dave Power's side of the fence ends up being like a huge problem as well. They end up getting a bad rap from all these people who are just like claiming, oh, this is inconsistent, this is inconsistent, this is inconsistent. I'm like, yeah, so we had to pull out that nature component and reduce it down to an octogram instead of the Enneagram in order to actually, have something accurate. Because when you have the 4 sides of the mind, when applied to the 16 types in the form of the type grid, and then you combine that with the octogram, you finally actually have a cohesive system of understanding, microdynamic behavior, microdynamic psychological behavior within human beings, which is nice, versus macrodynamic psychological behavior, which is when you talk about the Rosetta Stone and cognitive origins, and then how that interfaces directly with God functions and the temples, right? Input, process, output, feedback. Yeah, how nurture impacts our nurture. There are 4 paths of nurtural development. People are like, well, how is this an octogram when it's 4? And it's because your gender matters. Because while it's 4 paths of nurtural development, they're different when you actually look at different genders. Octogram behaves a little differently depending on your gender, okay? And that, I'm talking biological gender. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal because from the female side, your octogram is a little bit more consumptive, whereas on the male side, the octogram is a little bit more productive. Although we decided that it was not the most appropriate time to talk about those differences within the context of this lecture. We decided to stay away from that slightly. So yeah, kind of been necessary, but we'll talk more about that, about those subtle differences in future content, basically. So remember, everyone is subject to octogram. Everyone's subject to nurtural development, and how that happens is through a process known as soft locking, as I've said in the previous lectures. Soft locking, which I think is December 2022's episode of the Cutting Edge podcast. On that podcast, soft locking is discussed. But soft locking is a concept that Chris Taylor came up with, and then we've observed it in the field and okay, yeah, this is actually a thing. But basically, the idea is that, extroverted functions are obviously looking for introverted functions. The thing is, though, is that if your extroverted function that's looking for an introverted function, or the introverted function is being a source to an extroverted function, the optimistics have to match and the pessimistics have to match. And for example, if I was in a sexual relationship with an ENTJ woman, her extroverted sensing child would be trying to get to an introverted sensing aspirational. So she would soft lock me into my subconscious and force me to cognitive transition into my ISFJ subconscious in order to get at the introverted sensing hero of my ISFJ subconscious, basically. And that is the process of soft locking in general. If you want to learn more about that, your journeyman members, please go watch the Cutting Edge podcast episode related to soft locking because it is absolutely necessary. The octogram is basically, or human nurture, or someone who is nurtured within their life, basically, that comes from a perspective that comes as a result of soft locking. So psychologically, a person's nature is impacted via soft locking. They're soft locked into different sides of their mind throughout their life, throughout their upbringing, basically, right? Throughout their upbringing, this happens. And then as a result of that, they get into a situation. They get into a situation throughout their upbringing, and then it creates neural pathways, basically. It creates neural pathways, it grows neural pathways based on their gateway functions and their guidance functions, according to the cognitive circuits as presented by John Bodine. For more on that, go to our blog at csjoseph.life, search cognitive circuits, or search the word circuits or circuit, and you will find information about that. You might want to understand that as well. There's just so much information relating to cognitive mechanics. It's so hard to keep it all inside the context of season 18. It's like so difficult. It's so difficult to keep track of all of it because the science is just so big. That's why the most recent episode of season 18 basically looked at the entire science as a bird's eye view and broke it up into 4 parts and organized it by input, process, output, feedback, so we can actually see the entire feedback loop of how human cognition actually works, right? So that too is an issue. Okay. So, anyway, but yeah, our environment forces us to prefer one side of the mind over the other. Our family, communities, life experiences, we face pressure. Our brains, through neuroplasticity, adapt to our environment. Soft locking is the engine for octogram and nurtural development. Environment either enables or disables the expression of our ego. If you cannot express your ego fully in your environment, the pressure will lead you to other sides of your mind. However, your psyche is always still trying to achieve its cognitive origin, even from a different side of the mind. Soft locking ultimately refines your ego, also known as ego enablement, or expands it, which is also known as ego disablement, forcing expression to other sides of the mind. Soft locking is the result of your life circumstances pushing you along the path to enlightenment, basically. That's what it's all about. So, in the context of ENFJs, you know, when you have a rough childhood as an ENFJ, like for example my UDUF father-in-law, who grew up in Japan. His mother is full Japanese. His father is basically Puerto Rican. Well, half Puerto Rican, half Brazilian, basically. And because of that situation, it's kind of hard for him to be culturally accepted. And his INTJ mother was extremely abusive, like one of the most abusive people I've ever met. And so because he had a really rough childhood, he had to mature very quickly. He had to grow up real quick. And that literally turned into unconscious development, right? Versus another ENFJ who is enabled through soft locking, basically. And then because he was, because an ENFJ may be enabled, like in the example of my father who is an ENFJ, if we're just looking at nice dads, basically, my dad was really enabled by his dad. His dad is an ESTJ, or actually, more accurately, I think maybe an ISTJ. And he was really enabled by his father, who was his natural pair. And something that my father wished I was like. My father really wished that I was like his dad. And this created a lot of conflict between him and I through a series of unfortunate events. Oftentimes, I still believe that, as much as my father may claim that he's proud of me, deep down, I think he's actually just ashamed of me. Because, words are words, but actions really tell the truth. And if I was to judge him by his actions alone, I do not remotely think that he's proud of me in any way, shape, or form. Maybe, I just don't. But he's subconscious developed, and he was really enabled as a child, given what he wanted, given many opportunities, supported all the way through by his natural pair father, and then as a result of that, he literally became subconscious developed as a result of the soft locking of his natural pair, putting him consistently in his ego. My father became subconscious developed. And that's ultimately like how those types of things end up happening, through enablement and disablement using those examples, okay? So let's go in a little bit deeper towards the ENFJ archetype. So ENFJs are seeking validation. That's their cognitive origin. That's the one thing ENFJs want more than anything in the world is that. That's literally everything that they're going for, validation. They literally, every decision that they make in their life is centered around ultimately gaining validation for themselves because they are consumers of validation. They just want people to like them. They want people to value them. They want to feel special. They want special treatment. Special treatment is everything to them. And without consistent special treatment, especially special treatment that they themselves think they deserve or believe that they deserve, well, they'll never be happy. That's why they like being in positions of power, because if they've earned a position of power, they feel like that they deserve that validation all the time because they have a label that is protecting their ego, basically. Because an ENFJ who has to earn validation without being in a position of power, it's not so easy for them because people don't have to treat them in a certain way. And that can be really hard on them. People don't have to really show them respect. In like that position of power, in that position of authority, it's kind of like it protects their ego from external sources soft-locking them, and then they're able to be in a situation where they have to soft-lock other people, where they get to soft-lock other people, which in turn ultimately protects their ego. Something a lot of people don't understand about the authority cognitive origin and how it kind of interacts together with the cognitive origin of validation, right? So ENFJs are seeking validation through accuracy, correctness, reliability of thought, and judgment, refinement through education and teaching, and providing the emotional support to uphold those in adversity. Yeah, that's true. Paradigm shifts such as moving out of your house, taking on a new lover, changing careers or jobs, having a child, or starting over in a new city often force paradigm shift within psyche, which has a tendency to change cognitive focus. Because, soft-locking ends up happening as a result. Environmental soft-locking, personal soft-locking, job soft-locking. Soft-locking happens 100% of the time and forces where the external world forces itself upon our egos, and then as a result, we cognitive transition into the other sides of our mind, okay? This means that cognitive focus is far more variable, whereas cognitive development is far more static. This is often why childhood determines cognitive development, and adolescence determines your first cognitive focus. And as you age, circumstances change, your focus changes along with it, all right? As a result, you end up having the 4 variants of the ENFJ. So let me walk you through what the 4 variants of the octagram look like before we go deep into the details, okay? Let's actually look at that for a second. So let's look at that detail for a second. So what ends up happening is that if an ENFJ has been hyper-enabled as a child and they end up being enabled in their adulthood, they end up becoming SDSF, right? These are the really, really immature ENFJs. Or what if you have an ENFJ who's like my dad, who is really enabled as a child, but then all of a sudden as he gets to adulthood, he becomes disabled. He's disabled by the real world, disabled because the enabling of his parents did not really give him the tools, the mental tools that he needed to face reality, to face the world. So as a result of that, he became subconscious developed, unconscious focused, because he still has to go to his unconscious to utilize some shred of maturity from it to, compensate for the lack of mental tools, the lack of enabling within the rest of his life. And I'll be explaining more in detail as to why and how that actually happened, right? And then you get into the children who were disabled. You get those ENFJs who were disabled throughout their childhood, but then they escaped their family. They have the mental tools, the maturity to be able to get through life, etc. And they got out of that situation, which is great for them. But then they have things pretty well under control in their lives, and then because of that, they allow themselves to have fun and engage in a little naivete every now and then, engage in having a little of fun every now and then, such that people in their adulthood end up actually enabling them, and then they become enabled basically by people in their life as a result of their childhood. And this is the UDSF variant of the ENFJ. And then there is, painfully, there is the UDUF variant of the ENFJ. And UDUF is the ENFJ who has been entirely disabled by literally everything their entire life. And they're like super mega bitter. This means they had a really rough childhood, really rough adolescence, really rough adulthood. And they just couldn't escape the rough, basically. And from a UDUF perspective, they are basically in mental survival mode 100% of the time, and they just cannot escape the really crap or horrible circumstances. I feel really bad for them. Recently, when it comes to UDUF, I actually have come to realize that UDUF is kind of like a fake octogram. It's not a fake octogram though. Like don't quote me on that. Like what I'm saying is that it's a temporary octogram. It's very temporary. UDUF is designed as a survival mode for the brain to go to when dealing with rough circumstances. But as soon as it's out of those rough circumstances, it can go back into being UDSF basically. And it would require a paradigm shift to bring them back in that situation. Or the paradigm shift could be as simple as removing whichever external stimuli that is forcing their brain to be so uncomfortable that it has to go to the superego and sacrifice its inner child in exchange for power. So UDUF is actually more of it's not a permanent state of being. It's not a permanent way of living, basically, is what I'm getting at, right? And most people think it is, and it's really not. It's not really. I mean, even in my own experience, I've experienced, not having to deal, once I got away from my family, because I was UDUF basically throughout my childhood. Once I got away from my family, I became UDSF. But then I had to be around my family again due to homelessness, because I had to rely on their support, and I became UDUF again. And then I got away from my family again, and then was back to being a UDSF. And then, due to some recent tragedies in my life, I became UDUF again. But always, I could feel the tug. I could always feel the pull of trying to become UDSF in the process, right? But here's another way of interpreting, the 4 octogram variants from an ENFJ perspective. Remember, octogram has a tendency to change people's preferences about how they handle cognitive origin. And the cognitive origins available to an ENFJ, at least their primary and secondary origin, is validation and authority. So an SDSF ENFJ is basically looking for 3 helpings of validation. They crave validation more than everything because they had validation the whole time, throughout their childhood, their adolescence, and then mostly through their adulthood. So they basically expect their cognitive origin of validation ultimately to be served up to them on a silver platter. SDUF types, they're looking for 2 helpings of validation and 1 helping of authority. And then the same thing goes for UDSF. However, when it comes to UDUF, it's a little different. It's reverse. It's looking for 2 helpings of authority and power and 1 helping of validation, basically, which kind of sucks if you think about it. They even have to sacrifice their own desire for their own origin just for the sake of survival. And that, too, can end up being a problem for ENFJs in general. So, anyway, with them being unconscious, developed unconscious focused from that point of view, it ends up becoming a bigger problem in the end. They are sacrificing their own internal need for validation in exchange for power and authority, basically. And then, to get to that point, they're taking their inner child and serving it up to their inner demon, basically, and performing demonic child sacrifice in order to exchange for the demon's power, basically. And that, too, can end up becoming a problem for them later. And we'll explain why as we dig deep into the 4 variants. In comes the SDSF ENFJ. So I have a particular person in my life experience, who was SDSF, and that did have that kind of aspect to it. And this is obstinance, humility. Obstinance, humility. An obstinate ENFJ who is humble. Obstinance basically is the subconscious developed pull for the aspirational pull, and then the living virtue of humility, basically, because octogram is determined how close you are depending on your pulls, if you're closer to your shadow, your aspiration pull, or if you're closer to your deadly sin or your living virtue, and that determines your octogram. So SDSF, they are closer to obstinance on terms of their aspiration pull, and they're also closer to their living virtue, okay? And basically, this is the point of view where they're like, this is a right answer, and there is a right answer, and I will find it. That is like the overall theme of the SDSF ENFJ. They are so hyper-focused on their TI and what they think is true and what they think is socially acceptable. There is an answer, I will find it. I will solve whatever problem I can. They are like the ultimate problem solver. At least they see themselves as the ultimate problem solver. And that, too, can be a big issue, a big issue. So, for example, SDSF ENFJs are hyper-developed in their ISTP subconscious with overdeveloped ego functions. They have been enabled in their ego and encouraged to grow firmly into the natural development of their subconscious. SDSF ENFJs tend to be very confident in their ability and skill. Oh, my God. These are the overconfident ENFJs. Like, seriously, the major overconfident ENFJs are SDSFs. Hyper-enabled, okay? Yeah. Humility and obstinance makes SDSF ENFJs open to learning new things, but they will only accept new things after it has been thoroughly filtered with their own TI thinking, okay? I used to have a very good friend of mine who, very, very good friend of mine, very, very good friend of mine, who actually used to help me with my business. She was a really cool person, and she is SDSF, and she was hyper-enabled as well. And I really liked her. She was really great to have around. But the thing is, though, is that because she's SDSF, she just absolutely would not listen to anything that I would say at all. Like, this is a person who would tell me consistently that I was wrong. Oftentimes because of their obstinance. But whenever I would call her out on it, she'd be like, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and then go humble mode as a result. And it's like they end up becoming like these glass cannons, basically. This form of ENFJ. The SDSF ENFJ is the glass cannon, because it's like they expect you to enable them, and then all of a sudden you stop enabling them, and then they're like, "Oh, no, okay, yes, I will bow before your mastery after the fact." And it's like, well, hold on, that's not what I was trying to go for here. Like, that's not it. But they still have to filter through their own thinking. So they're more secure in their TI verification than their unconscious developed counterparts. To them, if thought hasn't passed through their mind, they do not expect it to be valid, basically. So these are like the validation inspectors, ultimately. They're so used to being validated their whole life that they think they actually have mastery of validation and can serve up validation to others. Like they think they are in a position of power over validation, basically. It's like they are validation controllers, validation conductors. It's so fascinating to me, Their reliance on TI can make them seem closed-minded, even though they are humble. Because they are SDSF, their TE demon and NE critic are usually severely underutilized, which makes it difficult for them to accept others' perspectives as valid until the valid perspective becomes the ENFJ's own perspective, right? SDSF, ENFJs can build up others extremely quickly, especially if others submit to the control of the ENFJ. They can be very good teachers, especially when actual skills are being imparted, not just information, right? And they feel the most validated by being a teacher. If they weren't a teacher, they probably wouldn't be able to live with themselves, let's be honest. And then we have the SDUF ENFJ, which is like my father, obstinance and pride. Now, like I say in every lecture, the SDUF version of each type is probably the people who end up having the roughest life, in the long run. The first will be last and the last will be first. And they literally exemplify that in terms of the first will be last. These are the first will be last people. And sometimes I feel bad about that. But this is obstinance, pride. This is my dad. I will show you the correct way, okay? This is a preacher. He's a pastor. I'm a pastor's kid. He's still a pastor of church to this day. And he's like, I will show you the correct way. And he's always been trying to show me the correct way my whole life, and has consistently failed from that perspective on a regular basis, and that could be like a huge problem, So SDUF ENFJs are developed in their ISTP side. Yes, my dad loves working on motorcycles. He loves working on cars. He loves doing anything mechanical. If he couldn't do anything mechanical to prove his skill, then he's just not going to do it. And he gets so obstinate with his skill that he will not allow anyone else to help him. And he has to be the one to figure it out. He absolutely has to be the one to figure it out. Sometimes, SDSF ENFJs will not ask for help either. They kind of have that issue, but it's not as bad as the obstinate pride variant of ENFJs, like my dad. Like, if offering my dad help is the fastest way to insult his ego entirely, it is the fastest way. I kind of feel bad, So they are developed in their ISTP side, but they realize usually that they're immature due to real world not being enabling. Thus, they develop their INFP side by relying on the pride deadly sin. And my dad covers up everything with pride. Anything that he is inept on, he has to hide it, and he conceals it with pride. He cannot. He is so hyper protective of his ego, and that's the thing about SDUF types. They're very hyper protective of their ego because they realized how enabled they used to be, and they're just trying to get back to that amazing aspect of their childhood. And my dad is that way, like especially like when it comes to Christmas, for example. He's always trying to recreate those childhood feelings that he had, as a little kid when it came to Christmas, probably when he was like SDSF. But he can never quite do it because he's SDUF, and he can never reach that level of childish immaturity that he used to enjoy. And that ended up becoming like a huge problem for him in his life. Poor guy. I don't get me wrong, I love my dad. I may say some negative things about him, still love him though. So that ends up becoming an issue. So SDUF ENFJs walk around believing that they know best. Oh my God. Yeah, that's my dad. Or at the very least, they are within reaching distance of knowing best at all times if they are given time to research and practice. Armed with the right knowledge, no one is better than me. This attitude can infuse them with confidence to be great performers and teachers. My one of the things to actually describe my father is that he is like the most confident person anyone's ever met, and it ends up being like so stressful because like so many people, even with my own family, think that my dad is just like the most confident person ever. When reality is, it's just a mask that he wears as a result of his own pride. It's just a mask. And it's so frustrating. It's incredibly frustrating. Because my extroverted thinking critic is like, he could see through it. He could see through his pride mask. But nobody else can. Nobody else can. And, sometimes, okay, that's not fair. My mother can see through it sometimes, but she just chooses to ignore it because she does the ISFJ thing of like putting your head in the sand and just kind of ignoring it from that perspective, which I find is entirely ridiculous. Like, and it's funny because like my father literally picked my mother because my mother enables him. That's the reason why they're even able to have a relationship, basically, is because she continues to enable him. And it's like she's trying to bring back these childhood fantasies, consistently to my dad on a regular basis. So obstinate and prideful ENFJs may treat others more stupidly than their unconscious focused counterparts. Yeah, that's literally how my dad is. He talks down to me all the time without even realizing it. And run the highest risk of assuming they are correct by default. Even though the SDSF ENFJ suppresses extroverted thinking demon the most, it is the SDUF ENFJ that tends to attack the most with their extroverted thinking demon, armed with the obstinance that I really am correct and you are not. You are wrong by default. And it's like, wow, how dismissive can you get? I mean, no wonder. Like my TI parent was never even allowed and is still not allowed to exist, much less even develop in the context of my own immediate family. And it's one of the reasons why I am unconscious developed, because my father's TI, there's only room for my father's TI and not my own. And then when my dad wasn't around, it was my mother's TI that was king, and not my poor little underdeveloped TI parent. And then they just forced me to use my FI trickster to produce FI for them consistently because I was basically their FI bitch, basically. And then my sister was born, and because, oh, she's a girl, we have to give her a lot more support, and she's held to a different standard than you, Chase. And so then she was basically enabled by my family to, consume my FI as well. And she gluttonously would consume my introverted feeling, even if it was just a trickster. So as a result, my immediate family became this, abusive situation where I wasn't even allowed to think for myself, like at all. And I still, to this day, I'm 36 years old, and still to this day, anytime I am near my family, I cannot think for myself. I'm not allowed to think for myself, like at all. That's how abusive these people are. That's literally how abusive they are. And they don't even know it. They think it's normal. They think it's normal to be abusive in this way. They think it's normal that they expect everyone else to listen to them, and they don't have to listen to anybody. And, in terms of thinking, I'm the only one in my family who actually has some shred of proper judgment. And that's scary. It's really scary that it ends up being my response. Anytime something serious is going on, who do they call? They call me. They don't call my sister. They don't call anyone else. They call me. So I end up feeling used, especially by my father, used by him, so that when there's a problem that he absolutely cannot solve, he'll come to me, ask me for advice, and then basically treat me as if I'm stupid, and then tell me I'm wrong, only for me to see him follow my advice later, basically, because he just can't let go of his pride, which is so ridiculous. I really am correct, and you are not. So their pride is utilized to develop their own personal philosophy in their INFP shadow, where they learn to lead with their introverted feeling and extrovert intuition instead of just refining others with their Templar perspective and improving others. God forbid. And then we have the UDSF ENFJ, my favorite ENFJ, okay, which is accommodation, humility, okay. That is the unconscious developed shadow pole combined with their living virtue. Very mature, but still willing to be immature and utilize to a degree and utilize their living virtue. And that is, what is necessary to learn is found when I understand what your needs are. And these are the people that really care about other people's needs. My aunt is UDSF, God bless her, and then which is funny because she and my dad, they hate each other's guts. They absolutely hate each other. They hate each other. It's so ridiculous. My dad is the know-it-all of the family, and everyone treats him that way, and everyone knows it, and he basically alienates everyone that he's around, and then everyone just loves my aunt because she's UDSF, Another UDSF ENFJ that I've had in my life was my ex-girlfriend, Kim. And she, overall, in general, at least 80% of the time, she treated me very, very well. It was just that 20% where it became disrespectful, or she tried to ruin my business, tried to ruin my life, tried to control me, eventually because she got really, really jealous of the extrovert sensing child because she knew me before I became C.S. Joseph. Then when I became C.S. Joseph, she couldn't handle it anymore, and she just never had to deal with the fact that, her boyfriend was basically becoming this person who was well-known and famous-ish and a public figure, and then all of a sudden, women were trying to get with him, and she got super mega jealous, and she just couldn't handle it. And so she broke under the jealousy. Her extroverted sensing child just broke. And my life situation as it changed just broke her, basically. And she couldn't cope with it. She had no ability to cope. So again, what is necessary to learn is found when I understand what your needs are. Okay, so UDSF ENFJs were disabled in their early environment, and my ex Kim absolutely was. Her family is extremely abusive, but when she got away from her family, she became more subconscious focused, and she became super humble. And this is a mega accommodating woman, extremely accommodating, very humble. Until she starts to see that her humility may not be getting her anywhere, and then to protect her ego, she'll utilize pride, but she only utilizes pride as a last resort, okay? So these people were disabled in their early environment, forcing them to stretch their INFP shadow. Later in life, perhaps in adolescence, they found a space that allowed them to grow, and they began to develop their ISTP subconscious, which in Kim's case, that was actually the situation. because I helped her get out of her abusive family, and then she was with me for like over 3 years, about 3.5 years, and she was actually able to be her own person and just kind of deal with who she was on her own. And she was accepted, and and all she had to focus on was be accommodating to me, and also present herself in a very humble manner, and it worked out pretty well for the most part. So they're the most open to learning and seeking out other perspectives than their own, and she had a very open mind. And while they're very careful thinkers, they have learned to rely on their value system and principles of INFP shadow. Their approach to thinking expands because of the inclusion of their personal philosophy. She was a very religious woman, for sure. Accommodating and humble ENFJs are the most flexible teachers, counselors, friends, and parents of all the Templars, and in my opinion, the most feminine ENFJs out there. They seek to understand the unique needs of individuals to ensure that those needs are seen and validated. These ENFJs hope others will do the same to them. It's so funny because Kim actually had a conversation with my mother at one point in time, and my father, in an attempt, basically. She attempted... which is just so funny. It's just so funny to me. But she literally went out of her way to try to repair things between my parents and I, trying to be this benevolent person to, respark and rekindle the relationship, hoping that, eventually, we might actually all be one big happy family again. But then my family took advantage of her in the process and gaslit her into attempting to lie to me and try to convince me that I was actually autistic, which was an extremely offensive situation because they just couldn't deal with the fact that, they just couldn't deal with someone like me would exist. And she tried because she would see just how much my family would hurt me. And she was there for me. And I'm very thankful for that. It's funny because the first time, to compare, the very first time I ever actually met my family, it was at a family reunion in Oregon. This was before we were married, and we were basically engaged. And I took her to a family reunion, the only family reunion we've ever been to. And literally, the first 60 seconds, the first minute that she met my father and I was in the room, my dad threw me under the bus publicly in front of the family. And then Railgun called him out for it. Hardcore. Absolutely just zinged him. Oh my God. And made him look so stupid in front of everybody. That was amazing. Deserved. On his part. So, yeah. Well deserved. But Kim tried to repair the relationship. And they actually really liked her. But then they started using her, and then she's like, okay, your parents are really dangerous. We shouldn't be around them anymore. And I'm like, yeah, that's basically kind of how it went. And then let's move on to the UDUF ENFJ, which is accommodation and pride, which is the adaptability of my skill proves validation. UDUF ENFJs, this is my father-in-law, were completely disabled in their early environment and continue to rely on their shadow functions in adolescence and beyond. There was not a complementary environment early on to allow their ego to flourish. UDUF ENFJs rely on their personal philosophy and their FI value judgments as their main tools for teaching and learning. They utilize education standards through their INFP shadow and ESTJ superego to protect their TI inferior. Quote, as long as I meet my standards, I'm validated. They rely on credentials and references to bolster their reputation, to further protect their inferior and give off the image of being intellectually reliable and credible. And they very much care about their credibility and their image. Oh my God. Accommodation plus pride makes them proud of their flexibility in adapting to others. But they may lack the foresight to see what others actually need, not just what would make them feel better. It's like all of a sudden an ENFJ's extroverted sensing child is like an extroverted sensing trickster. It's because they've sacrificed their SE child to their demon in exchange for the demon's power. And that's literally what my father-in-law did. He's got multiple degrees. He speaks 5 or 6 languages. He is the most overly educated person. He even passed the bar exam. He doesn't even use it. And all he is a high school PE teacher. Oh my God. but he's had to gain validation on his own and not get it from any external source. And when you try to validate him, he sees it as an insult, because from his perspective, he is the only source of validation and no one else is allowed to provide him that source of validation whatsoever. And if they are, that means by default they are trying to manipulate him. Unbelievable. It really sucks. The only way UDUF ENFJs could survive in their early environment was to be as insanely accommodating as possible. It wasn't about truth, TI, but about being a source of gratitude and having the patience to listen and give up their own freedom. They were likely not accepted or appreciated for who they actually were at all, which is really sad. And that is my ENFJ father-in-law. I take pity on him. I do love that man. I know that if there really is something that we really need, we can call upon him, and we just explain to him that yes, it is his duty to act, and then he will act. But he will act out of duty, not because it's something that he recognized that we need. It's all about duty. So this ends up becoming an issue. So naturally, once you know someone's octogram, granted, you can ego hack them. So let's talk about social engineering. If cognitive origin never changes, regardless of development and focus, then giving them their origin through their preferred poles is the best way to reach out to an ENFJ. So this is like the shadow pole and the aspiration pole. So accommodation, the unconscious development pole, is best met when you make your needs known to the ENFJ. They're trying to make you comfortable so they can be comfortable. Reward them with appreciation and freedom for their accommodation. However, the obstinance SD pole is best met with sharp questions and delivering opinions backed by sources that the ENFJ agrees are credible. Or you just subject them to endless Socratic questioning. That's what you do. You just go full-on Socratic with them and you break their TI inferior, and then they just melt into a freaking puddle right in front of you because they can't handle Socratic questioning. And like these are these supposed people who like to think and consider themselves philosophers, but they're really just glass cannons or paper tigers when it comes to anything intellectualized. It's like, great. Therefore, the obstinance subconscious development pole is best met with sharp questions and delivering opinions backed by sources the ENFJ agrees are credible. Go out of your way to agree on the points you agree with that they make, and tell them why their thoughts are valuable and how they have helped you or could have helped others. They use obstinance to protect them from being wrong or harming others. Both the four sides dynamics and the octagram are dynamic, but the octagram is even more so because it deals exclusively with nurture. The deeper implication of an octagram variant is to understand how the other temporal origins are siphoned in through the poles. And obviously, we talk a little bit more about that in the Ego Hacking by Text masterclass. So, anyway, it's just super fascinating, just how different these different kinds of ENFJs are, and we see it all the time. Like, you know, if you go watch on season 3 the episode, you know, who are the ENFJs, right? If you go watch that episode, and then, you know, as an ENFJ, and you're like, okay, yeah, well, I don't identify with that. Well, I don't identify with that. I'm like, well, because that episode, I'm talking a little bit about my ex-girlfriend who was UDSF. I'm talking about my dad who was SDUF. We didn't really talk about SDSF variants or UDUF variants of ENFJ. I really haven't, but they're there, you know. And that's the thing. Like, if I was going to do a redo of season 3, I would do all 4 octagram variants according to each type, and then it would end up being like, 16 times 4. It'd be like 64 videos to get through that because of their different versions. Maybe we should do that. But yeah, like, that's a big project, a very big project, even for me. You know, it's a big project. But that's the thing, like, folks, like, octagram is super important, and, you know, everyone still has these subtle differences based on their nurture, and then they start behaving in certain ways as a result of their nurture, and that's the key. That's what we need to be aware of as people in their lives, you know, these ENFJs' lives. And it's really important, like, you know, if they are being obstinate, get to fast to agree and be careful to, like, you know, you kind of have to walk around eggshells around their TI. It's just kind of frustrating. And if they're unconscious developed, guess what? You have to walk around eggshells around their FI, which is it's so crazy, you know, because their literal inferior function, their nemesis function is basically, you know, bound and determined based on as a result of their development as children, basically subconscious developed or unconscious developed. And these are things that you just kind of have to know when dealing with ENFJs on a regular basis. Of course, you'd have to know that with anyone. So, that's just kind of, the legitimate thing about it. So anyway, folks, that's it for season 32, episode 4. What is the octagram of ENFJs? Thanks for watching and listening. And I'll see you guys next month for our next round of premium lectures to you ego hackers out there. So anyway, folks, that being said, I'll see you guys probably tonight on the Discord. Later.